In this video, I'm going to be discussing how I came to view the stress of living with my disabilities, how it affected me, and the effects of my very inept attempts to manage it. When you grow up with psychological disabilities that impact your life on a daily basis for years on end, you don't initially start out hopeless. You instead try to find a method to your madness, a way to hold on to as much control as you can and give yourself a greater illusion than what you really have through management of sorts. So, growing up, I started to develop a construct, my own personal how Dan thinks he operates, and based on that system, I tried to manage myself. For those with a psychological background, it's very similar to the stress diathesis model. However, mine was always changing based on new awarenesses I have of myself. The best way I feel to explain this is to use a visual, so I have built my model around the idea behind Tetris. In the game of Tetris, you have blocks of various shapes and sizes that come down, and it's your job to adjust the blocks so they all fit together. The area of the game is life for a single day, and the objective is to get to the end of the day without the blocks reaching the absolute top limit. If the blocks reach the upper limit, the person will suffer a breakdown of some kind, aka game over. Each block is a potential life stressor, either handled consciously or unconsciously. In the game, if you get enough lines across an area, they'll disappear. However, for this model, we're going to assume the blocks don't automatically disappear when they're stacked appropriately. They can disappear, but only if the person gets breaks taken to de-stress. The zone that the blocks are falling into is your pool of resources to manage the blocks or life stressors. Now, except in the most annoying of Tetris games, a person can typically early on make wise choices with their block choices to maintain and maximize the amount of space. However, as the blocks start to drop faster, things become much harder to manage. Consider the speed of blocks being dropped as to how intense the stress in your life currently is, or how fast life is throwing things at you instead of coming at a nice, slow, predictable rate. This is where it gets a little bit more complicated. In my life, I would try to juggle the stress blocks of life and stack them at the bottom. However, I had a much lower resource pool. Before the game even begins, I would have to allocate a certain amount of space of the resource area to manage each of my disabilities. So, attention deficit disorder, OCD, depression, loneliness, autism, each one of these things would take pieces of the rows from the top of the pool until suddenly I had much less area to work with. Now, if the block level rises into this area, it's not an automatic end of the game. The trouble is, they're now intruding into the resource allocated area. When a person gets to this point, they desperately want to remove themselves from life, de-stress. However, that's not always feasible. The other option is to try to face the challenge anyway, try to juggle things to keep things going. However, juggling is sort of dangerous. In short, you roll the dice. Every time another block falls into that area, if you get snake eyes when you roll the dice, then you suffer a breakdown. Typically, the breakdown is somewhat related to whatever stressor at any given moment was being the most taxed, but sometimes it appears to be random. When a breakdown occurs, typically your life for a certain period of time is over, just as if you'd had a meltdown. This period of time can be anywhere from a few hours to a few weeks, maybe even a few months. Now, what I've described is the conscious model. This is how I perceive dealing with my life's stressors from what I could understand. Now, there's the unconscious model. This is a bit more tricky because, frankly, it's like many psychological models where the brain isn't something that can be measured and therefore is sort of left out of the equation. I only saw the effects and drew conclusions based on what happened. As near as I can figure, each stress block that falls into the pool also sort of falls onto this complex scale, sort of an alternate reality scale where they're both dropping at the same time. This scale is somewhat like the device from the television series Stargate. Each time someone presses one of these scales, it shifts all the other scales. My mental objective was to keep all the scales within a certain range. Every time a block fell, it would be dropped into one area and the scales would shift accordingly. However, how they would shift was either random or too complex to fathom. So, at any point, one scale rose too high or too low because of unknowable mismanagement, and I would suffer what felt like a random breakdown. Try as I might, I could never predict when a random shutdown was going to occur, which only added to my frustration. I would simply just theorize that the more problems a person has, the more random adjustments there are on the scale settings. Lastly, there's sort of a subsection. In the Tetris version, at least in regards to autism, there's an extra complication. There's a general aspiration in the autism community regarding the Star Trek character Spock, that he is to be idolized, that emotion and logic should be separated and emotion should be suppressed because it's too chaotic and unpredictable. And mostly it only serves to get in the way. However, like it or not, we are all emotional creatures. Whether we like it or not, we have to deal with emotions. Throughout most of my life, I had two separate minds, one for logic, one for emotion. And I had separated the management of my life's stressor blocks into those two pools of management. So they could either fall in here, they could fall in here. And I had this half-baked idea that what I was doing to myself was actually better because now I actually had two pools instead of one pool. Two pools, one pool, so I had two different sides that they could fall. It wasn't until later, during neurofeedback therapy, that I realized what my mistake was. I always assumed that the two pools were actually better. But if you take your emotion and your logic, you combine them, and you properly integrate them, the amount of space that the two pools could have was more than just the sum of their parts. It was like if you took 2 and 2 together and you added it and you got 4 blocks worth of space. Well, properly integrated, you didn't get 4 blocks of space, you got like 16. So I could vastly increase the amount of stress I could hold when the two of them were combined. All of this attempt at management was born out of a single desire to maintain control of myself. Control over the psychological issues, control over the negative feelings, control over all of these effects and all these problems I had outside myself. And most of all, maintaining what I felt was my own personal identity against the endless tide of chaos and despair that always seemed to define me instead. This obsession with control has been so ingrained into my life that it wasn't until recently I realized just how much it affected everything about me. How much it was a source of a lot of my problems that I encountered in my life. This was partially because of the paradox of control. Let's start off with how I would define control. Control is a muscle. It's something that we all exercise in every act of life. It takes control to do anything in life. Control is when one projects their will and achieves a desired effect. Applying control feels good. It should. Otherwise, people wouldn't develop any kind of ambition beyond basic biological drives, food, sex, shelter. Think about how often a person would attempt to influence themselves or their environment if it hurt every time they tried, or they felt depressed at the very attempt. Success and control are very intertwined. Now, early on in my life, I started to develop these unhealthy relationships with control. I would feel lonely, and loneliness would hurt, and it was painful. So to feel better, I would envision a fantasy where I would feel better. Early on, these were just fantasies of being somewhere else and being happy. However, as the pain kept coming, the happy fantasies just didn't cut it anymore. I would want to lash out. I hurt just like everybody else, and I would want to hurt something else in return. So in my mind, I would pair my desire for control with a fantasy to inflict pain, and I would get this pseudo rush of pleasure because of the tie to control. The pain I inflicted in my fantasy, both on myself and others, was just cycling, because it was my pain to begin with. I was only hurting myself in my fantasy, but now it felt good. It felt good because I was exercising control. So I had control, which felt good. I was inflicting pain, which isn't supposed to feel good, but since you're pairing to control, it does. So over time you learn that inflicting pain can feel good. It kind of mixed up. So the more I thought about inflicting pain while being in control in my mind, the more pleasure I got. Also, the bond between these two, control and hurting things, got stronger and stronger. Then, sex got tied to the fantasies. That sense of pleasure isn't pseudo. In fact, it's very real and very addictive. So now I had fantasy, control, sex, and pain all mixed up. This ultimately was a very unhealthy mess, because at this point I had started to develop bad coping mechanisms for dealing with my constant pain and not being in control. One is addictions. I have a porn addiction, and the accompanying masturbation that goes along with it. Video games, food, sleep, all these provided me with an illusionary sense of control, or numbed the painful effects of not being in control. Another was to cause physical pain to myself, either by cutting or causing painful abrasions to my skin. So I would also take steaming hot water from the faucet and plunge my hands into the water and try to ignore the pain. Even today, when I'm angry or frustrated or upset, I will grab onto something sharp and pointy and squeeze so the pain enters my skin. Naturally, these issues did come up when I sought therapy. However, the funny thing was that the root of the problem, control, wasn't targeted directly in therapy. In therapy, fantasy, sex, emotional pain, cutting on myself with razors, and other behaviors were all targeted, but control wasn't, at least not on its own, separated from other issues. I guess it's because targeting control was like telling someone to stop breathing. You can't do it and maintain life. People have to have control, and they have to feel good about using it. So the idea of manipulating the element of control just didn't ever seem to register or make sense. The irony is, what so many therapies prescribe is take this medication, it'll help you control. When you have negative thoughts, see if you can apply control and change those thoughts. Or even worse, just control thinking about those thoughts. Or think about something else when they arise, which is an exercise in control. Every solution ties back to the same thing: flexing the muscle of control. For those with chronic psychological issues, the problem of understanding this paradox is massively worse, because their whole life revolves around attempting to apply control and watching it fail, and developing the idea that it failed because they just weren't strong enough. All the while, they're only making their other issues more difficult, because that muscle and those control associations are being flexed into overdrive. And then it's compounded by the fact that you gain no reinforcing surge, because The constant attempt at control fails. However, control in your mind, that's always successful. And to make up for the unsatisfactory implementation of control in reality, the reward system in your fantasies is always boosted. So, more and more, the fantasy of control takes over the reality of control, because that's where you find the most and the best reinforcement. My current solution to this is something I am only now just trying to do, which is letting go of the comfort of fantasy control and reinforcing or refocusing my attempts at focusing on the reality of control. This is not easy. In fact, it's very scary. I am leaving behind my comfort zone and returning to places where signs of failure hang on every door. Failure that has not just hurt me, but hurt other people around me. And while I can take the signs down off some doors, others, not so much. I and other people still wind up getting hurt. And there are times I want to sit down and stop trying again. But here I am, still plugging away.